This podcast is brought to you by Infinite Resources, a local staffing agency connecting diverse job candidates in central Iowa companies.
Amplified.
Welcome back to Black and Privileged in America podcast, Power, Love, and Money conversations relevant to Black thriving, supported by Infinite Resources. I'm your host, Abena Sankofa. In this episode, I am outside, and I'll be chatting with Black farmers in America's heartland. But first, catch Black and Privileged in America podcast on the Amplified DSM network, on our YouTube channel, and everywhere you listen to podcasts. Today, I'm in community with Todd and Chris Western of the Western Family Farms, the oldest Black legacy farm in the state of Iowa. And we're on site at Minerva's Meadow Farm, owned by Hannah Skates Kettler and her husband, Curtis Kettler, in State Center, Iowa. Todd, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Listen, how are you doing on this beautiful afternoon?
It's a lot better than yesterday.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful day.
Yeah, it's a beautiful day. And this farm is beautiful. We're at Hannah's farm, and it's just absolutely gorgeous.
Minerva
here.
Farm is definitely beautiful.
Yeah. So tell me first, I just want to jump right into the reason why people know your names and that recognition is growing is because, Todd, you launched the Iowa Farmers of Color Conference last year.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like and what inspired you to start that?
Well, the experience was an experience I did not expect. It was, I think it's my why moment. It's in honor of the ancestors that came and settled the farm in 1864. It's also in conversations with my younger son about the plight of the Black farmer. In 1944, 14% of the farmers were Black. Today, there's less than 1.4%.
Wow.
And so because of what me and my brother and my mom go through on our farm of, we don't know what we don't know, I wanted to bring farmers together in one group so that we could, one, network together, know each other. Number two, bring allies of farmers together. And number three, to fill those gaps of the information that we don't know.
So you said that your family farm was established in 1864.
1864.
So we're talking about 159, 60 years ago?
This year it turns 160 years old.
Okay, that's incredible. The oldest Black legacy farm in the state of Iowa.
To our knowledge. Hopefully there's one or two others that are the same age, but to my knowledge, we are the oldest.
Okay, so tell me, what is that? What is that? How did that happen? Tell me your family story.
In 1790, Henry Lucas bought his way out of slavery in 1790 for $700.
Okay, my goodness.
And then he worked several years and then bought his wife and children out of slavery. And at that point, they took a covered wagon and they went west. Like most people in America at that time, the West was something to be conquered, and that's why they wanted to build a new home and get homestead. And as a matter of fact, the government was offering special deals to homestead out west to settle that. They drove across the country and settled in New Sharon, Iowa.
New Sharon.
In about 1863. And you got to remember, at that particular time, Emancipation Proclamation had just been cleared, the Civil War had just ended, and then we settled a farm in 1864. Fortunately, Iowa was a friendly state towards slaves because they're like the end of the road for the Underground Railroad. And so they were able to settle in Mahaska County, and in addition to other family members, but ours was settled in 1864.
So what does this mean for you now that you and Chris, both of you are at the helm? Your mom is the CEO of the company.
Right.
But you two are largely visible in the state, in the community. You're the faces of the work that you're doing. What does that legacy mean to you right now?
Well, I mean, Chris and I, you have to remember how we got here is, was by tragedy. And through tragedy, we became closer. We had to come together as a family. So my father died unexpectedly in 2008. And so 2008, after the funeral, as a matter of fact, 2 days ago was the anniversary of my father's death. He was 1 week from his 65th birthday and 9 months from his retirement. And so that tragedy brought us together, and we had to continue to farm. And then Chris, we just have different paths on how, Chris keeps us together as the glue, is keeping the machinery running, because he's the one that listened to my dad when he was fixing things. And so
there's always
right.
the one that don't listen. Was that you, Todd?
That was me. I did not listen. I said, let's just call somebody and get it fixed. My dad had an engineering background, and Chris has an engineering background as well, as far as just knowing how things, and the curiosity of knowing how things work. And so he can talk about his legacy, what it means to him.
Yeah, it's, one of the big things for me is after the passing of my father, some people go to cemeteries to pay respects. Farming is my way of paying respect to my dad and staying connected to him. To me, it's much more meaningful to keep the farm going. In fact, that first year before we went to no-till, I was tilling, and it took me probably 3 times as long to finish, because I would have flashbacks, and I'd have to park the tractor, shed some tears, and have a memory. I remember we had to fix something here. I remember we had a conversation here. And I can remember just about every single event throughout the field as I was tilling. So that first year was pretty hard. It took me quite a long time to get through it, but it felt good as years went on to continue this legacy and continue the farming. I enjoy doing it, and I just feel like I just stay close to my dad that way.
So even now in your work, you feel like you're close to your dad?
Oh, absolutely. There's many times if something breaks or we have to adjust something, my brother will, especially when we first got started, he didn't realize how much I knew, and he always asked the question, well, how do you know that? I'm like, well, right over there by the lane, the same thing happened, and this is how we fixed it. Oh.
Yeah, I was playing in the dirt or driving the four-wheel in the field.
Right.
So yeah, it's just a better way of staying connected to my dad and showing respect, and it makes me feel good to keep things going where you see a lot of families, the parents had something that they had going, and the kids just weren't interested, and then it gets sold and leaves the family's hands, and it just feels really good to be able to keep it in the family name. So,
do you both feel that you have a special connection, not just to your dad and what he taught you, what he left you, but also a connection to the land at all? And what is that like? What does it feel like?
Well, Chris brought up a great point, is that, and I kind of forgot about that. Literally, I bet he and I can walk into the field and pick every spot where they had a meaningful thing happen, whether it was bad, good, or indifferent. I can pick a spot where Chris almost cut my hand off in the field when we were playing around with a machete, cutting weeds out of corn. I can spot where, we had a bumper crop. I can spot where, stuff broke down. I definitely spot where we got stuck in the field. So those types of things, and Chris reminded me that, like, when I go out there, I do think about that, especially our bigger farm down here is like, I can remember different things happening in the field. And so to answer your question, I just feel close to that for that reason. And then number 2, understanding the history and tragedies of black farmers in America. And so therefore it becomes way more important to me now that this is bigger than me, that I have to preserve this and I have to tell our story. And that's how this whole thing started, was me telling my story about the history of the Western farms.
You said something really profound right there. You said, this is bigger than me. And I see, Chris, you nodding your head too. So I would imagine that the notion of this work, this movement, really what you catalyzed is a movement being bigger than you, and then launching the Iowa Farmers of Color Conference. And now today, the reason we're here at Minerva's Meadow Farm is for the Iowa Families of Color Cookout. What is this like? I talked to some ladies before we got started with this podcast, and they said that many of the people who are gathered for the cookout don't know each other. The vibe I got was like it was a family reunion. So what are you really creating here with people who are relative strangers to one another, but there's this sense of community? What are you hoping to do as far as your impact on farming and black agriculture with this movement?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, it's part of our ancestry. I mean, you've visited Africa several times, and farming in any community, black, white, or indifferent, in any community, everything's centered around food and growing. And so it just happens that in America we're scattered. We still have that sense in us, and that's why, like today, as you noticed, it was like we'd known each other forever because we just come together.
Truly, I thought everybody knew the next person.
Right, and so that camaraderie is always in us. It's just we're so spread out, and that's why I take great pleasure in the fact that I brought everybody. I'm that connector, that bridge builder to bring everybody together. And a side story is that I brought two of my cousins together on my father's side I haven't seen in 40 years, and they came today. One from Missouri, one from Nebraska, and me and Chris haven't seen them in 40 years.
So what was that connection and reunion like for you?
Oh, it was wonderful. It always bothers me that relatives don't see each other than funerals, and so this is a really nice change of pace.
Beautiful. What are you learning about yourselves in this journey of agriculture? I mean, did you know when you were children that this was something you were going to be doing, or did you have no clue at all? And then what are you learning about yourselves?
Well, that's one thing I've been thinking, and ever since Todd started this initiative, one thing I learned about myself that I learned from my dad and other farmers, back when I was a kid, there wasn't that sense of work together. It was competition. Farmers are always spying on other farmers' fields, and you didn't really want to ask for help because you didn't want people in your business and things of that nature. But, with Todd putting this conference together and bringing us all together, I'm realizing that isn't necessarily true with all of us. But that's just kind of the generation that I grew up in. It was a little bit more of a competition. You don't want anybody in your business, and I'll figure it out on my own. But this is really opened my eyes up to that it doesn't have to be that way.
And especially, at the end of the day, you got to remember, my dad was the first person. I don't think he would have liked this, because in his generation and his father's generation, you kept everything under the radar for various reasons. Number one, if you're doing well, you didn't want the white man to know.
Right.
If you're doing bad, you didn't want your peers to know and the white man to know.
Right.
So therefore, you want to keep everything quiet. So my dad's situation was, because we didn't have 2,000 acres, we didn't have the latest John Deere equipment, and our crops didn't have those clean rows. Always be quiet. Don't tell anybody.
So you said 2,000 acres. Is that the standard?
Well, it's really 1,000.
1,000 acres.
If you had 1,000, you're in that world. You're a legit farmer.
A legit farmer is 1,000 acres.
Right.
No, don't be quiet. Just don't. But what we didn't realize is, because farming is isolated anyway, whether you're black or white. But so you don't really, unless you know your neighbors, and you don't have any black neighbors, so you just have yourself. We were fortunate to have one neighbor, Mike Cook, who we had a good friendship with. You don't really know what's going on outside the farming world, so you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
Wow. Okay, so now I'm wondering about your dad and the fact of, I know that generation was a relatively private generation for good reason. I think back to my dad too, very private. My mother, very, very private. What happens at home stays at home kind of thing.
Right.
And that could be a good thing, particularly for them at that time. But also it could lead to some traumatic things and how we work through things as a family or not. Mm-hmm. What if you could give your dad advice based on what you know now as two adult men accomplished in your fields and carrying the heavy lift of the movement that you've begun, what advice would you give your dad today?
That's a tough one, because I respect the era he came from and why he did things the way he did. I respect why he felt about certain things. I respect why he was private. So I think some advice that things don't have to be so competitive, or there is room for collaboration, good positive collaboration, and that we all can there are people out there who like to collaborate that say, I honestly don't know everything. What do you know about this? Well, I know this about that. And that it's possible to do without any negative consequences. I wouldn't expect him to jump head first into it because, I mean, that's the majority of his life. That's what it was. You kept close to the vest. But I think I did some of that during the later years, trying to expand things. For one, I always joke he was like the big kid in the sandbox. He always got the biggest toy and never let me play with it. But it was after his passing, it really dawned on me that I think I had a sense that some drastic change was coming, because I got real pushy about combining. I said, Dad, you've never let me run the combine before. Oh. So I hate to admit this, but I had to snitch. I had to go tell Mom.
Oh, we brought Mom in.
Yeah, I said, he's never let me drive the combine. You've never driven the combine. That next night, at the end of the night, we had 10 acres left. He reluctantly said, here, you can do the last 10 acres.
Oh, wow. I can't wait to talk to your mom.
Yeah, Mom got on him about it.
That's awesome. And Todd, what about you?
And so you have to remember, to my dad and that generation's defense, is that there wasn't the space to have this conversation. Right? To be interviewed and to have our farm acknowledged. So they didn't have that space. So in today's world, there are, the USDA, NRCS, FSA, those type of agencies are a little bit more open and creating spaces for us to have these conversations and creating a space for me to have the Iowa Farmers of Color and for them to attend to say, hey, here's what you don't know. Here's some of the cost-saving programs that you have available to you. And so he definitely did not have that in his era. So therefore, he had to be quiet about it, right? So, but like I tell people, we did not do this on our own. It's like a relay race. He had his leg, and he did a good job with it from what the tools that he had. He handed it off to us under a tragic situation. We are taking our leg of the race, and we're going to do our best to use our platform to uplift the farm, use that platform to talk about other farmers as well. Because, again, it's not about us. Because when my father passed away unexpectedly, we had to learn everything pretty much on the fly when it came to programmings and costs and things of that nature. So we don't want the next farmer to have this situation. We want to have readily available. And we had to go back and, research information, research history. And so me and my mom are big history buffs. And so, we went back and got history together. And then once I realized it, I was like, we got to uplift this farm. We have to do our part on our leg of the race.
No, excuse me. One key thing that I've learned, because I am spitting an image of my father. So when Todd first started this, I honestly was a little reluctant because I just learned that from my dad. But one thing that's been exciting going through this journey is one of the big things that I think will help others that want to get into farming or want to is that a farm is a farm. It doesn't have to be 1,000 acres. It doesn't have to be 2,000 acres. It could be something in your backyard. That's farming. And so I learned that mentality from, back in the 70s and 80s that, you felt like if you only had 100 acres, people would call, oh, that's just a hobby farm. And they would put you down for only having 50 acres or 100 acres. And I'm learning through this journey that farming is farming. I don't care if it's your backyard, 50 acres, 100 acres, you're a farmer. Whether you're growing vegetables, row crops, microgreens, that's farming. And I think that's a key thing to understand for the younger generation, because growing up, we were kind of looked at as strange for being black farmers, that black people don't farm. And I'd always say, what do you think we did for 400 years? And before we even came to America, we were farming.
That's the point. Yeah.
Right. So there's been a disconnect with the African-American population that we don't farm. And I think what Todd's started here is going to help young African-Americans understand, or people of color in general, yes, you can farm. And
Absolutely.
It does not have to be 1,000 acres.
I think you bring up a good point, Chris, is that, farming is farming. And that's going to be incredibly helpful for people who are growing things in their backyards and in whatever their surroundings are, to help them understand that they're a part of a larger community. And as our time wraps up, I mean, time flies when you're having fun, but I have a couple more questions for you. First of all, are your children in this industry as well? Are your children farming?
Yeah, so one of the things that I discovered out of this, and Chris brought mention of it, when the whole thing of Dad letting him combine, that was a generation thing. And one of the downfalls of farmers in general, and particularly black farmers, that we don't have a succession plan. And so, and that's one of the bigger reasons why farms, black or white, don't succeed and go on, is because, especially in the black community, we don't like to talk about death. We don't like to talk about, when I die, here's what's supposed to happen. So that was my dad's era. And so what I've done is I've tried to learn from that, and I've got my son involved, immersed in this information. I now have Todd Western V, who's 2 years old, who will be immersed in this information.
Wow.
I have my daughter, Alexander. My daughter's 26, my other daughter's 10. And so getting them immersed in this, so that way, if something, God forbid, happens to us, they at least know the value and the history of our farm, and why, even if they don't farm it, they can still maintain it and run the business of the farm. They can let somebody else farm it, but they know the business and the history of the farm, and they can talk intelligently about the Western family was part of 1.4% of the black farm population, and they could potentially keep this Iowa Farmers of Color going as well. But yeah, just keeping that going.
Yeah, see, and without that, we see it doesn't matter what nationality you are. You see in this day and age, farms that have been together, kids they don't know anything about it. They just sell it.
And it's not cool.
Right. It's not cool. It's too much work. Just sell it. And 80 years, 100 years is just thrown out the window because they never made the connection of how valuable this is, whether they want to farm it or not. Things just get sold.
Well, I think what you're doing by sharing your story here on Black and Privileged in America podcast and other outlets, and with the movement, I think you're dispelling the myth of farming not being cool, because I feel like this is the coolest place to be right now.
Right.
So thank you both so much for sharing your time in this space with us today. My last question to you is, Iowa State Fair, are you going? Do you go? Like, what's up with that?
My wife has to make me go to the Minnesota State Fair, let alone come down to the Iowa State Fair.
You ain't been to no fair till you come to the Iowa State Fair.
I would. But you know what though? I love the Iowa State Fair because Iowa State Fair is where they honored us for having our heritage farm.
Right.
So I will always give love and respect to the Iowa State Fair. But I live in Minneapolis, and so I probably won't be, but
I'm sure I'll catch one day at least.
I'll see you by the funnel cakes, Chris.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Thank you both so much for being
you.
here today. Oh, what a great time. Learn more about the Western Family Farms at westernfamilyfarms.com. Subscribe, like, and share. Find Black and Privileged in America podcast on www.amplifydsm.com and my website, abenasankofa.com. Stay engaged. Stay curious. Keep striving. Thanks for listening. Until next time.